Gefühlsecht. Die vierte Macht.
Hello and welcome to Europa Gefühlsecht, die vierte Macht, which translates into something like European facts and emotions and the power of the media as the fourth estate. This series is all about the power of communication, and today we want to look especially at the responsibility of high-quality journalism to secure a soundproof general understanding of the happenings of the world. We need serious media to balance, for example, dangerous political developments when it comes to threatening democratic principles, the rule of law, or human rights. But we also need free and diverse media to raise awareness to social imbalances or injustice. Not an easy job to do these days. The reality nowadays seems highly differentiated. Fake news, alternative realities, disinformation, conspiracy theories, and the likes are not only dividing society, but profoundly change the way how people see the world and how they believe truth is constituted. So we do know that fact-based data is one source for trustworthy messages. A lot of the distributed ideas that occupy social media today look exactly like that, although they are not. And even experts and scientists join in conspiracy theories and help to create a general climate of distrust. So who to believe? What is one of the major questions and what to believe is the other, when even reliable scientists often can't give clear answers to complex topics like COVID-19. Difficult questions, and I'm very happy to have a distinguished interview partner today who will be able to shed some light on the actual state of the media, especially the high-quality journalism in Europe and the world these days. A warm welcome to Barbara Trionfi. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Nana. Thank you for having me on your show.
This is really great to have you. You're an executive director at the Vienna-based International Press Institute, which is a global network of media professionals dedicated to safeguard and foster media freedom and actively promoting quality and independent journalism. You have an academic background in international relations and human rights, and your field of expertise covers areas related to press freedom or the safety of journalists. So let's start and dive into our topic. There are a lot of challenges for quality journalism these days, from the question of the mere survival in a digital world and of getting heard and understood by the civil society to being allowed to work and spread information at all. And the freedom of the press is in danger, even in European countries. From the perspective of the International Press Institute, what are the biggest challenges to quality journalism these days?
So thank you very much. Thanks for your introduction also. And let me try to answer your question as briefly as possible. I would say I would group the challenges that the media faces today in three categories. First of all, you mentioned press freedom. So a number of press freedom violations and attacks against journalists and against the press. These go from killings around the world to threats, physical attacks, imprisonment, very much on we have seen a great rise of imprisonment of journalists in the past year, for example, across the world in countries such as Turkey, Egypt, typically, but also obviously some countries that have been traditionally jailers of journalists, from China to Vietnam, Iran. But another problem that certainly also journalists in our part of the world are facing are legal prosecution, both criminal and civil suits. As a consequence of their reporting. So basically accusing journalists of criminal activities in connection with their coverage of, for example, corruption or wrongdoing by government or by people in power, or slapping them with very expensive civil lawsuits is a very, very common practice. And this indeed also leads to great self-censorship, also in our part of the world. The first group is the broad press freedom violations as we know them. The second group of challenge, if you want, are economic challenges. You mentioned already a weak business model of the news media. We know that, news media traditionally supported by the advertisement sector, with advertisers moving to the social media platforms, have found themselves in big crisis. And we have seen this process going on for the past decades or a bit more. But additionally to that, obviously what we see today are independent media in particular being suffocated by it, because they operate in markets that are manipulated by autocratic governments. Close to Austria, we have the example of Hungary, we have the example of Poland, of Turkey. Typically, these are media markets where you have a business sector that is very close to those in power, very close to the government, and a manipulation of this business sector by the government. And with manipulation, I mean putting pressure on certain businesses to avoid supporting or giving ads to certain critical independent media, leads basically to the fact that independent media have no funds to survive. It's a very difficult issue to tackle, also from our point of view, because it's so subtle. But we have been working closely also with, for example, EU institutions related to market competition and other EU standards that should be in place to address this type of issues. But it has become, if you want, the easiest way to clamp down on independent media recently. And thirdly, we are looking at an increasingly hostile climate against the media and against journalists. The events in Washington on the 6th of January are a typical example of that, and we have spoken a lot about it, but this is a global trend across the world, both in autocratic countries, but also in less so, also in countries that are generally perceived as democracies. There are other either government or other political parties that portray the media and the journalists as the enemies. And this is greatly challenging journalists because this legitimizes attacks, even physical attacks, additionally to a wave of online attacks on social media against journalists and against their credibility. So this is the type of these are the type of challenges that journalists have been facing. And in all these three groups of challenges, we have seen an increase in the past year.
Wow, a lot to talk about. Let me start to get a little bit more light on the circumstances of systems where it's functioning in a good way and other systems, let's name them like that for the moment. We know that when it comes to press freedom, there are these northern European countries who always are in the rankings on top, like Norway, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, or the Netherlands. What are they doing differently to the others? And we know at the lowest side of those lists of press freedom, we have North Korea, for example, or Turkmenistan. What are the signs for a good country in that respect when it comes to press freedom?
Sure. Let's start from the good ones. What are countries that are generally perceived as respecting press freedom doing right? First of all, these are countries where there is, in general, a high level of trust. Trust in institutions, in the sense trust in public institutions, trust in government institutions, and as a consequence, trust also in the media. And these are countries where from the top, so from those who are in government and as head of all these institutions, there is a constant communication to the people about the important role that the media plays as a counterbalance, as part of a system of checks and balances, which is core to any democratic system. So in the moment, and also these are countries where, and I'm referring particularly to certainly Finland, Norway, where there is a good communication, a good exchange of information, again, based on trust and on acceptance of the reciprocal role between those in power and journalists. The information, there is an understanding that information needs to be given out to the journalists. There is a trust that journalists will cover development in a way that is in the interest of the people, and therefore in the interest of the of the system we live in. And certainly there is an acceptance and a desire that if there is corruption, it should be at the highest levels of the power. It should be uncovered by the journalists and should be and it should be revealed. So I think really trust is the key issue, and an acceptance of the fact that obviously the media is there to criticize and to scrutinize those in power, and it will not always be pleasant, but is that role, and we need it because in order to make the system we work in work. What do we see on the other side? On the other side, and you of course you mentioned China and North Korea. North Korean is definitely an extreme. We don't even know what is honestly happening, but like the level of control is such that but even take China. China is precisely the opposite, right? China is a country that shows an effort to control the media message. So media, not only from a structural perspective, are controlled by the government, by the ruling party. The editor's position are appointed by the government directly through a system of, of appointments and nominations. If anybody, there is a very small level of criticism accepted just in order to, on one hand, in order to give a perception of independence, and on the other hand, also because as long as it is convenient to those in power that certain types of corruption is being revealed. For example, certain type of wrongdoing are being revealed by the media. So a little bit is tolerated, but then at one point, editors may or journalists may go one step too far and they're out. So it's also this lack of clarity about where the border is, where are my limits. You never know how far you can really go in criticizing, in revealing wrongdoings and all of that. And this generates self-censorship, obviously, because you never know which one is the step that will either get you out of your job, so you lose your job, or even get you in prison. And additionally to that, obviously, behind all this, there is the justice system. Obviously, Nordic countries, as you said, these have very independent justice systems, and countries like China. But as I said, also closer to home, some of the countries I mentioned before, Hungary or Poland, have justice system that do not ensure independent rulings. So.
Coming to justice and also to the human right of free speech, we have nowadays a lot of not only professional journalists, but also civil society, citizens, who write, for example, in social media about things they don't see working well. We know from Hong Kong, for example, that there is also incarceration of civic people, but also from other countries who go to people who go to demonstrations and so on, and the justice is injustice is done to them and to the human right of free speech. How would you say in Europe, especially, where is the gap between the right of free speech and the red line of crossing towards fake news, misinformation, or even conspiracy theory? Because we see this happen a lot. There is some gray zone in the middle, but it's rather small. And then we have an either-or society. And due to the right of free speech, people seem to be allowed to spread lies. So what do you see from a professional point of view? Where is the red line and how to deal with that situation?
Yeah, it is absolutely complicated, and you know, we have been discussing, I mean IPI, but all the international community has been discussing for years now what is the best way to fight disinformation and how to even define it. Now, even the term free speech, which only 10 years ago maybe would have been connected to something that most people would have perceived as something positive, now it is very much used by certain groups to push for, you know, a complete deregulation of and a lack of any system of control on the information that is being disseminated. IPI is a network of editors and journalists, so obviously we care about quality. Actually, as part of our vision, which was defined already over 70 years ago by the founding fathers and mothers of IPI, there was a balance between promoting press freedom and promoting quality information. So for us, it goes hand in hand, and I'm sure as a journalist, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So, you know, I think that we have, especially in Europe, globally as well, but certainly in Europe, we have a very strong set of international standards, which are to a great extent respected at the national level, and that very clearly defined what are the limits of what should and should not be published. Now, fake information, so information that is not correct, is not illegal. So we all have the right to publish information that is not correct 100%, as long as it is not defamatory, as long as it is not in breach of the interest of the nation, and you know, there are a number of restrictions there as well. However, and again, then we need to differentiate between journalism and not journalism. So what is journalism? Journalism is a profession, and is a profession based on certain criteria, on certain standards, on certain ethical rules, and it operates within those. So obviously within the journalistic profession, the truth, the aiming at facts and fact-based information is a core aspect. So these are very different platforms that we're talking about. And we need to be very also careful in limiting information on the basis of what is true and what is not true. And I'll give you an example for that. In the past year, throughout the pandemic, a number of countries, also in Europe but outside as well, have rushed actually through Parliament new fake news legislation. So legislation that is supposed to tackle disinformation, particularly arguing that there is a lot of disinformation going around in connection with the pandemic, in connection with the virus, and we need this type of criminal laws. I can assure you that, and IPI has been monitoring this, in every single one of these countries, these laws have been used and abused by those in power to clamp down precisely not on information that is false or is not accurate, but on information that is critical. So on information that is different from the government line. If the government said today there are 100 people dead, and somebody publishes a piece of information that said, actually, I went around and looked in the hospital and there are 1,000 people, whatever, that have been died as a consequence of the pandemic, this is then it is defined as fake news, and there is and these anti-fake news laws have been used to clamp down on that. So it is very difficult, and I think we need to be very careful what we do with regard to disinformation. Again, I also think it's very important, and it is the duty of the duty is a role that journalism can have to reveal what are the sources of all this disinformation that we're seeing, who is behind that, who has an interest. very often there are strong economic or political interests behind this. So I think that is the key issue. And that is what we need to reveal and make our viewers and listeners and readers aware of. So if I see certain information that is not entirely based on scientific facts about whatever it may be, vaccines to anything else, who has an interest in this and what is behind? And these are the type of journalistic investigation that we need.
Very interesting. Let's dive a bit deeper in that situation that we are living in. The world is somehow breaking up into two parts. So we have those who believe in fact-based and reliable quality journalism on the one hand, and those who object the so-called mainstream lies, as they might call it. And this separation of the society, it's a big topic when it comes to the execution of human rights, to the democracy or rule of law, because we need a certain common reality and set of rules that are accepted by civil society and politics as well. And the threats of a splitting society and the manipulation versus information war, they can't be overestimated. So you said a little bit already what media can do to close this gap, but let's start with this really heavy accusation of a lying press. How can quality journalists and quality media, how can they answer to these accusations that, they are only promoting elite opinions or what the governments want? And there is a lot of distrust actually out there. How to regain trust, how to react to that?
This is possibly one of the issues that has been discussed the most amongst our members around the world, is really how can we ensure that our readers, our audiences understand that the information that we are giving to them is valuable for them. And it's complicated because, as you know, there are hundreds psychological studies about how people react to certain type of information, how they tend to trust information that comes from their peers, from friends, from people whom they trust, without looking beyond whatever we're from and where this information comes from. So it is really complicated, and it has come to the point where, for example, as one of our members from the Associated Press was saying, we are looking at a situation where the New York Times releases an investigation into the taxes that President Trump has paid or not paid, and is an investigation based on facts. And people just don't believe it, but they don't believe it just because it was published in the New York Times. So it is very complicated because, as you say, we have come to a point where either you are legacy or you are, legacy media, or you are something else, and then there is a big distrust between these two groups. I think what journalists have been doing so far is basically try to explain to their readers and listeners how they do their jobs, how to really basically saying, I'm giving you this information, but I also show you the process that has led me to this type of information. I'll show you that it is not true. It's not that it comes from the press release that has just been put out by the government, but this is how I've come to it. I've consulted these type of experts from different sides, all of that. So basically show the people the process behind. At the same time, people also have been, journalists have been talking about the need to, so on one hand, to debunk fake news, but also to, I think they call it pre-bunk or something like that. Anyway, to start the process before, explaining to their readers how disinformation is being created. How do you recognize disinformation? And, from minor things like if you see something popping up on your social media that says, this is what the news outlets will never tell you, and then comes a piece of information, 99% of the times, most likely is not correct. So they basically teaching their readers and listeners to how to recognize these information and how to value information on the basis of the journalistic work that is behind. So this is what has been done. The other very, very important aspect is to bring back local news, to strengthen local news and local communities. Again, I trust the news that is produced in my town because I know the journalists, because it's close to home, because, for a number of reasons. And that's why quality local news is key and is something that we have seen disappearing around the world. Even in Europe, we have seen what are called news deserts, basically large parts of countries that are not covered by any local news outlet, and that's a major problem. So we need to get back the local news and the local quality news.
One question also about bridging the gap between those two big bubbles, the believers in the system, let's say like that, in quality journalism, and the believers in these alternative realities. Would there be an idea about how to bridge that gap, how to foster a culture of discussion between these two bubbles? Is there any idea out there how quality journalism could invite those two groups that seem to differ so much?
Different things have been tried, and things have been criticized as well. We have seen, for example, the New York Times has been heavily criticized for inviting external writers or commentators from a completely different point of view. Basically been criticized for disseminating the type of opinion that is not supporting the democratic system we believe in, according to the readers of the New York Times, So I think it's really difficult. Efforts have been made. But it is really complicated. What people generally agree on, and studies support that, is really that a good quality and strong public service broadcasters is a key aspect of this. There were studies around the BBC, considered one of Europe's strongest quality broadcasts, about how important it is among those who watch the BBC to, exactly to be able to be confronted with different types of opinions. But on the other hand, better than me, the average age of people watching public service broadcasts is normally above 60. So it is really, really, it is a big challenge. I think that we just need to continue trying also to invite different voices and explain where from the other perspective comes. Also journalists, we need to accept the fact that very often, unfortunately, the journalist community is not diverse enough. And we know that, and we need to do something about it. It's not diverse neither in terms of ethnicity, languages, but also very much in terms of the social background. So we need to include more diversity in the community of journalists itself.
Mm-hmm. That sounds very interesting. And you also teach at the Walzer University, for example, in Vienna. You teach about media ethics and media literacy. And what you say, it sounds like if we knew more about how news are created or how opinions are developed, then we could understand deeper why people are in the spaces, in the belief fields they are in, and how to bridge the gaps. So to go a little bit deeper in this educational process, what kind of education or understanding about the media world and about the creation of truth and reality do you think citizens would need to not fall into the traps of fake news or disinformation or conspiracy theories?
Yeah, well, I think it's very much learning about both. It's learning from an early age on, and not only at university. No, currently media literacy is taught primarily at university level and not even in all university, but I think obviously you need to start in school. You need to start much earlier, and then continue through other channels. The school cannot be the only channel where media literacy is being taught. You need other platforms where this is shared with other types of audiences. And you need to learn, on one hand, exactly how journalism works. You need to establish closer relationship of trust between the audiences and the practitioners. Let's invite the journalists to the classrooms. Let's ask the journalists themselves to tell us how they do their job, and also very honestly let them talk about the challenges they face and why sometimes indeed they may not be right. I think there is a lot of conversation. Obviously, you know, journalists do make mistakes, and it needs to be accepted and it needs to be acknowledged also. So let's be honest about it, but also explain how do we come to these mistakes and how we try to overcome them after. So this is one process, and the other is, for me, what is missing even more, both in the education but also, as I said, in the media coverage. We don't know yet enough about this information. For example, IPI has done a number of studies around, in particular, online attacks against journalists, and online attacks against journalists go hand in hand with the disinformation. It's basically the same actors have an interest, on one hand, in sharing information that is not accurate, on the other hand, in ensuring that those credible sources, which are journalists, lose credibility. So online attacks against journalists come to a greatest, originates, especially if they are organized campaigns, originates from people in position of power. Can be the local mayor, can be somebody connected with the government, with the foreign government. There are strong interests behind this. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about it again, based not on my opinion. Oh, I think that the far right is sharing this information. Let's talk about it based on facts, on research, and joining the academic research with journalistic work into this.
Mm-hmm. So what you say is something that sounds pretty dangerous, that it's actually political interests interfering with the journalistic work. And this is also happening in some European countries. But how I perceive it, at least, the distrust that is developing is actually concerning the still democratic governments and not those governments who are actually doing that. How to give that a picture back?
Indeed, there are governments behind those attacks. And as I said, we have done some studies around it. We would need much greater resources to go more in depth. But as I said, IPI is just one of the entities that has been looking into this. And it's also not so complicated. You work with, there are experts out there that know how to trace back a certain type of message that goes viral on social media, and know where from it comes. And very often it is, as I said, there is a person in a position of power. Some time ago we were looking at, but this was already in 2016, we were looking at these type of attacks in Turkey, and we saw a big campaign originating from the then mayor of Ankara, for example. And you see that how they operate with a fairly small group of paid, what we normally call trolls, of paid aggressors. And then it goes to the next step, which are the supporters, the political supporters of this group. And then it goes viral. And it goes viral based on issues that we cannot even control, based on the fact that, maybe very, very often these attacks against journalists are based on misogyny. So you tackle into all the group of the misogynists that you have out there. And so let's call this journalist a prostitute, because they all are. Or it's really and yes, indeed, there is no. But yet this gives, if you look at it just on the social media especially as a journalist, but anybody else, the perception you get is that everybody out there is against me. Nobody knows why, but that's entirely wrong, and that's the type of perception that we need to debunk through proper investigations out there. It's not that the society out there is against the journalists or is supporting disinformation or whatever. There are very clear patterns on how this is being disseminated. So I think that there is a lot of work to be done there.
Very interesting. So one way to deal with fake news is to find out who is behind it, who is in a power position that could profit from messages like that. But talking about objectivity and subjectivity in media, in former days it was the name of a paper, perhaps the name of a certain journalist who guaranteed some quality standards. In social media, it seems that all there is needed is a lot of people who click yes and who share, or some friends who share something, or some seemingly like-minded people, or some pseudo experts who share content, and it looks reliable, and that's it. So is there any, you mentioned some criteria already, but perhaps a little summary, is there any 3-point check system? What criteria justifies the trust in a message? What can people believe in, and where should they, at least have an alarm in their mind set off?
Sure. I mean, I think that still we need to still differentiate between journalism and other information, because one thing is journalism, and I think what you mentioned about having the trusted, I trust these media, I trust these journalists, your trusted sources of information, I think is still very much there today. And this is certainly something that I would also teach my students, that, there are different news organizations that we trust from a different political spectrum, and not only the ideology that I feel more closer to, but there may be media that I trust, or there are plenty of media that I trust in terms of information, but present points of view that are very different from my ideology, and they're still valuable information. So that is one thing. The other is whatever happens on social media. Social media is a bit of everything. You have great journalism there, very often in representation of those news outlets that already exist. You have good sources of information, independent sources in countries, also coming from countries where independent media is not allowed to exist. So these also need to be protected and are extremely valuable. How do you recognize them? It's difficult. Normally, of course, it's a question of, researching who is behind, researching whom they are connected to, who trust them, very much an issue of, you do require quite a lot of expertise there, but it's very often, especially, as I said, in countries where independent independent information is otherwise not allowed to be circulated. So you have to do a lot of research through at the local level in order to understand where they stand. And then there are a number of opinions. There is my opinion, there is my friend's opinion, and these are valuable as well, but they may be right or wrong, as any conversation in my living room. So I think that we really need to differentiate all this. How to recognize if a piece of information is likely to be true or not. Very often, most of us starts by Googling it. Most of us start by, see what comes up. Recently, there was the news about, people who died in Norway after receiving a vaccine. So what do I do with this piece of information? Do I need to be worried about the vaccine? Do I need to be worried? So just Google it, look at who has said about it. And most of all is really, in the end, is trying to get to the facts. And who are these 23 people? who has been researching it? Is there an academic institution I can trust, for example, behind this research? Is there any other news organization I trust that has covered it? So I think it's just a lot of research and going in depth. So not just taking, most of us just reads the headlines, and that's not enough, obviously.
We also know about the fact checker sites where we can also go to, like from BBC, but also Mimikama in Austria, for example. Let me just try to tackle once again the perhaps most difficult question. If people are already stuck in conspiracy theories, they will not use those means to find out what a scientific institute is behind. They will not trust the serious, the quality media, the classical media of their countries or of their areas. So they are already stuck in a certain bias and prejudice and precondition of being against everything that seems to be coming from a serious source. Is there any insight how to get into those minds that seem to be already closed to a different view?
Honestly, I heard a lot about it, but I haven't heard about a solution on how to approach this from a society perspective, if you want, because very often, even if you look at trying to get people whom they trust, talk to them about this, we know that it does not always work. We know about the many family fights that have been fought because on the basis of what some consider misinformation, some consider being too close to the system, or so not critical enough. I just think it's complicated. I think we need to live with that and keep trying to do what we are doing. And I very much hope that as our kids will be able to deal with information that they receive from social media way better than we are, or way better than our parents are. So I think that it's just there is a learning curve there, and we just have to continue trying. I don't think I have the secret solution, but certainly what we cannot afford is to lose journalism, and this is what is happening now. So this is the biggest problem we are facing, that we are coming into a phase where these trusted sources they don't exist anymore because they don't have the money, because their journalists have been imprisoned because of a number of reasons. So that is for me the biggest concern.
I think it's very helpful to see everything as a process, and also a process to raise awareness. So now we have the chance to raise awareness for what it means that a media is considered as a high quality media, or a journalist is considered to be serious and to be reasonably trusted. So we have this opportunity for meta communication. What is quality in communication? I think this is very helpful. So let me ask you how to strengthen quality journalism. What can we do as civilians, but also what should politics do to strengthen the position of quality journalism as the fourth power in European democracies, for example?
Mm-hmm. For me, the first step is to, and I go back to what I mentioned at the beginning with regard to countries that have very high standards of press freedom. First of all, we need to send a message, and this needs to come from the top. Our politicians, the political elites, need to send a message about the fact that quality journalism is a very valuable good for all of us. And I'm not seeing that. I'm not seeing that, not even in a very well developed democracy like Austria. You constantly see a lot of criticism about how the media covers certain issues now, as I said, more recently, the virus, this constant effort by the government to retain information, to control that information that is out there, without appreciating the fact that what the media is trying to do is to see, you know, okay, I take what you tell me as government, but I also need to take other bits and pieces of information that come from other sources in order for our readers to be informed about it. And so I think that, first of all, the message needs to come from the top, and it needs to really be a message about we need and we want the media to remain independent. And secondly, you need, again, and this again comes from the top, you need ways, especially these days, to support them financially. And again, I'm looking at Austria just because that's where we live, but we see similar problems in many other countries, way more serious than here. I don't think that there is, that the public funds are currently being used to support quality. That is not a criteria at the moment. And there have been different proposals from very good journalistic institutions, local journalistic institutions, on how to do that. You know, and you can look at the Press Council, you can look at journalism associations and so on how to ensure that if there is any public funds, so taxpayers' money being given out to the media, they go to those news outlets that strengthen the quality of the information that we receive. And not only the quality, but also the information that we can actually receive. And again, I'll give you an example. The support that has been given in Austria to news organizations as a consequence of the crisis generated by the coronavirus, in the end supported news outlets that have very large print copies. These at the time when everybody was sitting at home and looking at the news on the internet. So this is just a small example, but we need to really define a way to support the media through public funds that is supporting quality. And then we can go into the old big conversation about public ads for the media, which again should go in that direction. So I think we need to rethink it all with a focus on quality and with the trust, because the hurdle is always, you know, the question, oh, but who defines what quality is? We know what quality is. There are criteria out there. We know what journalism is and what random opinions are. There are criteria out there. I mean, certainly journalism is not an exact science, but it is based on a very clear methodology and ethical standards. So let's apply those. Let's admit that we can set up institutions that can act independently and at least try to go in that direction.
Could you tell us a little bit more about, you know, media ethics, about these ethical standards, about the quality that actually, you know, the facts that make quality? Is there something that our viewers and listeners could learn from you towards that topics?
Well, yeah, of course. Ethical standards are normally defined both by, in every country, they're both defined by journalist association, as I said, typically press councils, but also by the news organizations themselves. So every news organization operates on the basis of large sets of ethical standards. If you look at the ORF guidelines, the BBC guidelines, there are books and books of how each photo, each article, each opinion needs to be approached. And the bottom line is really, first of all, is the accuracy. So try to get the news as accurate as possible. As I said, we need to accept that mistakes happen, especially in the profession of journalism, because we need to act fast, and very often we need to it's difficult to get the information from the sources, especially if we don't have an access to information law, what is called here Transparenzgesetz. So we need to accept that sometimes mistakes happen, but we need also like as one of the core ethical principles, is to really try to reduce the possibility for these mistakes to happen. And there are very clear methodological steps that journalists know how to take in order to get there. There is the accuracy, there is the fairness. Be fair. Don't get one opinion, get three opinions. Be fair. Try to reduce your own, be aware of your own biases as a journalist and reduce them. So of course, we all have a political opinion. We all have opinions about a number of things. We all have lived and grown up in certain circumstances that make us biased. But yet we need to, and again, there is something that journalists learn in their profession. How do I reduce my own biases in order to ensure that they're not reflected too much in the article I write? And if they are there, then I'm open about it. That's why, so that my readers know about it. And thirdly, for me, the other core principle I would like to mention here is to act in the interests of the public. The media has a public function, even private media. Certain, they're private entities. They very often are profit-making entities. So there is that element, but we need to keep those who make the news very separate from those who look at the money. So those who aim at earning more money need to be very far away. Very often, really in the building, the news building, they sit on different floors. They ensure that division is really also physically there. Very different very separately from those who define what the content should be. The content should never be based on how do I make more money. And so I need, as a journalist, I need to act in the interest of the public, in the interest of those who are out there, my readers, my listeners, my audiences, and beyond. And how do I do that best? And I think these are the core principles. And then from that, we can go into many other more specific guidelines that really define every single article, every single photo, every single the communication with our sources of information. Who are our sources? How do I deal with them? The confidentiality, the fact that if sources want to remain secret, they have the right to remain secret. If you give me a piece of information that you don't want, and that you don't want me to reveal your name, it is very important that I keep that confidential. Otherwise, the next time you don't give me that piece of information. And so all of that.
Very, very interesting. So let's come to the last part of our interview and to the perspective of civil society. We know there are lots of people out there who not only like to be recipients, but who are also communicators and who also definitely contribute to the variety of worldviews that's cruising out there in the world. So what kind of advice could you give them as the civil people, civil society, as communicators in the internet most of the time? What advice would you give them to help them create more reliable and more trustful content, also connected perhaps a little bit to the quality standards of classical media and journalists?
Sure. First of all, my first piece of advice is contribute, is participate and contribute. The news media has recently also moved in a direction to include more and more what I call user-generated content, include community, give the audiences the possibility to comment on articles, to exchange opinions about it in the comment sections of the newspaper. So, and I think that is an incredibly positive development. Most of us will not only read the news article, but very often read what the comments. And of course, maybe 25% of that, 50% of that are things that are not irrelevant. We learn to skim through those, but in between there are really valuable opinions and really valuable contributions. And journalists also very often react to that. So their next article on that topic will be based also very much on the input that is being provided. I've seen very often, quality news papers, for example, coming out with an article with a header that is biased, is perceived as biased. The user would comment on that, and the header is changed, for example, or so we do react to that, and journalism can only get better because of the input it receives from the readers and from the listeners. So I think that conversation is absolutely is the new aspect of journalism. Journalism is not what this journalist does. Journalism is what the community generates as well, and I think that as readers and listeners participate in this conversation, because it is extremely valuable for all of us. And additionally to that, of course, we also need to appreciate the fact that journalism is expensive. Even just, what I just mentioned, the ability to moderate this type of forum require a lot of additional skilled staff members. What we see out there, the discussion that we see there is, in most of the cases in quality news outlets, is heavily moderated in order to avoid that the hate speech appears, that comments which are just with illegal content, with comments that are just, this is a good opportunity to promote my shop. That all that is removed, and it's not censorship, it's just because it doesn't belong in that conversation. So I think that we need to appreciate that journalism is expensive. It is becoming more and more expensive also because of this. And as consumer, we need to accept that we need to pay for it a little bit. So contribute to it, both in terms of offering your opinions, valuable opinions, your information, also give the information that maybe is missing from that article, but you have that piece of information, but also contribute to it financially, because it's a good.
Thank you very much for this great insights. A very interesting talk this has been. I would like to wish you good luck for every aspect of your work, very valuable. I might also add, after what you've said, I would really like to point out how valuable, especially also dealing with the prosecution of journalism and the different challenges for the press freedom and the problem of limiting diversity in opinions. So all the good luck from our side, and thank you very much for this very interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Europa, gefühlsecht. Die vierte Macht.